Okay, hi, I'm Brian Kardell. I'm a developer advocate at Igalia. And welcome to another episode of this web history that we do with Igalia Chats and BlinkOn. We try to capture sort of an oral history of the web with the people who helped build it. So it should be interesting for all of us and hopefully for posterity. In 100 years, maybe somebody will look back on this and learn something really interesting. So with me today, I have Chris Lilley. Chris, say hi.
Hi there. Hello, everyone.
So Chris is known for a whole lot of things. Is maybe the only person that I know personally who has an Emmy, right? Um, so yeah, we'll talk about that. But also known as sort of like the father of SVG, has the greatest handle online, SV Jesus. And you've played a whole bunch of roles. We'll talk about some of them. But Chris, you were involved in the web since like wow, very early days.
Yeah, 93, I think, maybe possibly late 92.
How did you get introduced to the web in 92 or 93?
Well, if I can go a little bit back from that, I quit my job. I was in biotechnology, and I quit my job and went back to the University of York in England to do a master's. And it was networking was the hot thing, right? There were terminal rooms. People would get on. They would go to FTP sites. They would go to chat rooms. They would do all this sort of stuff. And that was all brand new to me. I hadn't been in that sort of environment before. So, yeah, that was kind of the social thing there. It was like people would sit all night in the room doing stuff and then groggily make it to their lectures or not the next morning. But that was when the web was being done. That was 89 to 90. But I didn't actually come across it myself until a few years later. I was working at University of Manchester. I was a technical author writing training materials about computer graphics. And I came across the web. There was a thing called Net News then. I don't know if people remember that, NNTP. So there were posts about this. And the first, this is a bit embarrassing. The first browser I ever used was the CERN line mode browser. I literally telnetted into CERN on port 80, and there was a screen, and I was like, clicking around or typing. Actually, no, not clicking, typing. Yeah, link 4. I'll have 4, please. And it was like, this is rubbish, you know. Uh, it was a plain text interface. It gave me things like a list of all the phone numbers of researchers at CERN. I'm like, I don't care. And also, this looks just like Gopher. So I confidently but inaccurately stated that this web thing was rubbish. But I was working in a computer graphics lab, right? And I heard, and we were doing, radiosity and visualization and that sort of thing. And I heard that another lab in the US, NCSA, had a web browser which would download images. You could actually have an image. It wasn't in line in those days, but there was a link and you could click on it and the image would pop up in a new viewer and you could share images. So I think the second browser, the one that I actually used, was X Mosaic like 0.12 beta or something like that.
Right? Yeah.
And there was new versions every few days, right? So this was cool, and I could immediately see the application. So we put up a web server for the lab, and it was called info.mcc.ac.uk because the CERN server was called info.cern.ch. This was before www was the thing that everyone used. So, that's what we called it. And also, nobody cared at that point. So we didn't ask anyone for permission. We just, downloaded the software, put the thing up, and started adding content, which was what everyone did for a few years until suddenly departments would go, oh, wait, no, I have to take all of this down. This is all unauthorized. And they would put up like a 4-page brochure for the university and everything else was forbidden. But that was the early days. And if I could, I'd like to mention the third browser.
Totally. Yeah.
I'd heard about HTML3, by which I don't mean 3.2, by the way. 3.2 was rubbish. But HTML3 was interesting. It had, figures with captions and all sorts of stuff. And I went to a demo of that at the first web conference, which maybe we'll get to later. I didn't actually see it because his HP workstation was broken and he couldn't get it to project, and it was just, um, full of the audience full of people shouting things like "Sync on green" and "Try this" and "Do that," and so it didn't work. But that was fine because when I got back to Manchester, we had this thing called Andrew's file system, which was kind of a proprietary thing, but again, worldwide networking. Right, you could CD to slash, and you'd be at the root of your university's whatever. But then you could go up from there. You could go to slash AFS and then a domain name, and then you were on whatever they decided to export as their file system. So I went to actually his area at CERN, and I downloaded the Arena browser, which was supposed to be an HTML3 browser, and that was fun and interesting. One of the first to support PNG, for example.
That was, I think, that was originally, it was Dave Reggett, right?
That was Dave
Uh,
Racker. Yeah, that's right.
and it was it based on the HTML plus largely proposal? I believe like there was
Um,
kind of what shook out of that.
Yeah, it shook out of that, and it didn't last very long because the IETF basically went, no, 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 you can only
Right.
standardize things that are all done and implemented, and we're not having this. Stay with HTML2. I was involved with HTML2. I was on the IETF group that did that. But there we are. Yeah, that's the early browsers that I used.
So I know that both math and graphics like were apparent needs for the web, like very, very early.
Mhm.
And you talked about like PNG, and you talked about your work in graphics. So I'm wondering, like, I would like to come to the start of the W3C in a minute, but like, were there efforts around something about vector graphics before the W3C even started?
Yeah. So there was an ISO standard called Computer Graphics Metafile. And some people promoted that literally just because it was an ISO standard. Also because my boss at the time, Mr. Hewitt, he was actually on the ISO committee that did it. So he was that was my first introduction to standards, all these 3D standards that never went anywhere, like FIGS and GKS and stuff. Um, but yeah, so they were pushing that. But the problem was, I mean, you could get a plugin for it. I was involved in registering the MIME type, but you couldn't do anything with it, right? So I remember actually, this was a few years later, but I had some slides, right, and they were, I forget what they were, what colors they were using, but it wasn't very good. There wasn't contrast. There were complaints, vocal complaints from the audience. Next time, can you change the colors to be like, say, white on blue or something like that? And me, full of bravado, says, "Oh, I can do that right now." Brings up the CSS, changes 2 lines, hit refresh, and all the text has changed color and all the graphics haven't. And I was like, oh, we need something where you have stylable graphics. And it took quite a while to eventually say, no, CGM isn't it. And all sorts of people were coming up with all sorts of different ones. HP had one, Adobe had one, IBM had one, all these different ones. Some of them were based on Java. There are all sorts of different approaches. So eventually we said, like, okay, we're going to start something on vector graphics that's explicitly for the web. I wrote a requirements document, and we got a working group together, and we all went, we're not going to start with any of these. Actually, we're going to make our own thing. But it was so refreshing, right? Up till then, I was talking with network engineers. I was talking with people that did HTML, and anything about graphics was really, they're like, you mean like pixels? Whereas with these people, I was like, well, we have to have Bezier curves, obviously. And then we spent 5 minutes deciding whether to have cubic or quadratic. And it's like, well, we'll have both. We'll just have segments in each, and that's fine. And there was so much agreement right from the start. It's like, of course we need this. Of course we need that. I did get into trouble, though. I said we have to use CSS to style it. And the people who wanted a pure XML thing were absolutely furious. In fact, some of them actually raised a formal objection and tried to get me fired for contaminating their lovely standard with CSS. But I think I was borne out in the end that was the right way to go.
Okay, that's really interesting. We've gone a little bit out of order now, but
Yes.
no. But so W3C was started in 1995, I think,
Yes.
and you were like very early employee, right?
Yes, I joined in April '96. Before that, I had worked on a couple of things. I worked on the PNG specification, and I'd worked on HTML2, which I have a funny story about, so we should maybe get back to that at some point. But I went to the first ever web conference at CERN, and then I went to the fourth one because I got a paper adopted that was about graphics on the web, not just decoration, it was called. And I went through all the things that were wrong about it and I wanted to fix. And on the basis of that, they basically hired me. And then my first day there, Håkon Lee said, yeah, Chris, graphics are important, of course, but I think you should do fonts and stuff as well because, it's not enough to fill up your day just doing graphics. So
So you, I think, were either one of the first chairs of the CSS working
I
group,
was the first chair.
the very first chair of the CSS working group. That's very
Yeah.
interesting.
So the way that happened was they were still finding their feet. They were basing themselves on what the X Consortium did, which didn't always work. And they had what they called an editorial review board that would somehow review specifications. It was a bit weird. And everything was in there, basically, HTML and CSS and the DOM. And then they split it. There's like, no, makes no sense. And so they invented working groups. And I was made the chair of the CSS one.
And then also web fonts.
Yeah, web fonts. So there was a printing workshop in like the first couple of months, so May or June of '96, and we were trying to get, what do we need to make the web not just online but on print, but also some things from that would make the online experience better. And one of them was web fonts, and people were talking about. The main thing they were concerned with was IPR, right? The technical aspect of it was barely considered, but everyone was terrified, frankly. I went to a typography conference, ATypi, in Reading in '97, and I felt so out of my depth. I turn a corner to the building where it is, and there's people with like safety goggles and chisels, and they are carving in stone. I'm like, oh my God. And then I tell them, hey, we're going to put fonts on the web, and they can be just downloaded like that by anyone, and it'll be great. And they're like, you killed my babies. We are the last generation of people who will ever create fonts because you've taken all the money out of it, and blah, blah, blah. We did actually get a spec together about, which was where At Font Face came from. But then the group dissolved into fighting and deciding what format would be used, and we didn't decide on a format. And eventually that group got closed down and the stuff got moved into CSS. CSS2. I'd been involved in one, but from the outside. So for CSS2, we had that font face. But again, we didn't have an actual format that you could use, which made it kind of useless. And Microsoft came up with one, but it had all this, it embedded OpenType, but it had all this DRM stuff around it, and people didn't like it. And they were very worried that effectively the browsers would have to become the police. The browsers could be held responsible if someone used the browser to circumvent copyright and download something. So that really didn't work. And then with SVG, we noticed that people were creating stuff in graphics programs, and they would select all the text and they go, convert to curves, ding, and you get exactly what it looks like, but it's not text anymore, and you can't search it, and you can't edit it, and it's not accessible. So we basically made the simplest possible thing that said, convert it to curves, but wrap it with this markup so we know what each curve corresponds to. And this was a really basic font format, which persisted embarrassingly long. It was just to get, but that was implemented on all the pre-smartphone things that had little SVG things. They could display those. But then it was taken out of the CSS spec because nobody, in quotes, had implemented it, apart from all the SVG guys and Microsoft. And that didn't count. And it wasn't until much later when we came up with this WAF format, which was really just a compression of OpenType with a bit of metadata at the top, so you could link to a license, and it turned out that the font guys were perfectly happy with that. They're like, so every time they download a font, it has a link to the license, and so if we sell a font to someone and they're using outside a license, then we can take them to court. That's And what does the browser do about that? Nothing whatsoever. Nothing. So everyone was suddenly happy. The browser guys who thought, oh, the font people, they want, cast iron DRM and they're going to break the web. And the font guys who thought, oh, these people, they just want to give away everything for nothing. It's ridiculous. So within a few years, the typography conferences that I was still going to, I was no longer a pariah at that point. They were big announcements. Adobe is making all of our fonts available for the web. You can license them for web, or you can license them for print, or you can license them for both and pay twice as much money. Yippee! And suddenly it was a business model, and it worked. And the percentage use of web fonts went from 0% in like 2011, and it's now 85 to 90%. It's become a thing that everyone uses everywhere, except China and Japan.
And web fonts are what won the Emmy, right?
Yes, it was all that work putting together the earlier CSS work, and then WAF, and then WAF 2, which is more has better compression and things. And it was, that's what won the Emmy.
That's amazing. And then SVG. Were you the chair of SVG?
I was also the first chair of SVG, yes. As I said, there was an attempt to oust me because I kept doing unpopular things like insisting on CSS and stuff. And eventually, because of that, they didn't fire me, but they introduced the idea that there was a staff contact who would be separate from the chair, and the chair would always come from a member company, not from the staff, whereas before the chairs all came from the staff. So I got moved over to staff contact, and then it continued on like that. It continued on for a while, and it was initially successful, but a lot of the browsers didn't like it. And then they basically absolutely refused to implement anything new that we did. So the first version became the only version. And after a while, that actually really preyed on me, the amount of antagonism, and that we put all this work in, and that people would be saying, we're never, ever, ever going to implement this stupid stuff. And so eventually I actually left that group and I moved on to other things where I felt my time would actually result in something like CSS.
Well, what I like about I don't know if you know this, but I'm the co-chair of the MathML working group, which was restarted.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And along with SVG, they're the two other, like I said, math and graphics were two very obvious gaps. There were, like, even in HTML+, there were ideas about how we fill both these gaps. And they both had sort of this similar problem where, like, there's a lot of interest, there's like uses, people get excited about it, but yeah, it's difficult to get implementers to want to do that. But both of those are the only two things that are integrated with the HTML parser.
Right.
And they're in the HTML standard under other embedded content, and you can kind of embed them in one another.
Yeah.
Which is very cool. And Igalia has been working we did the MathML implementations, but we also have been working on a new SVG engine. I don't know if we ever talked about this, but
you mentioned it, but I don't think you've told me much in detail.
My colleagues, Rob Baus and Nicholas Zimmerman, are the ones who wrote the SVG engine in WebKit originally, all the way back, the original one,
right?
Which then became the one for Blink, and they really liked and believed in a lot of the things that were done with CSS, the CSS integrations, and but the code paths were basically completely separate, and so there's been a lot of work on that, and we're really hoping that can restart. So anyway, fingers crossed, we'll get there eventually.
So does that integration include, so a thing I've noticed, right, we add something to CSS like white color, gamma colors, and it's like, will it work or will it not work in a given browser? And you flip a coin and maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. And can you do this? Can I point to a gradient? Oh no, not those gradients. You can't use those in SVG. You have to do it this other way. I mean, there's a lot in SVG to hate, right? The document object model, frankly, at that point, HTML didn't really have a document object model. It had am I in Internet Explorer or Netscape, and forked to completely different paths with completely different, and the idea of a consistent parse tree was also a distant dream that we like to pretend happened, and it wasn't. So the only thing we had to copy from was the smile DOM, which was never widely implemented, but that was the only standards track document. And so a lot was copied from that, which is why you have all this thing.val.baseval.animatedval stuff, because it had all of that, because the idea was you could always get the animated value of anything and you could change it through script and it would all ripple through this. Anyway, it made it a very horrible and much hated document object model, but there we are. It's good to hear that if there's more integration. I think that's the important thing, not just the parsing, which obviously is already there, but yeah, if CSS stuff can be used in HTML and in SVG, and you can do all these things, it's like for a newcomer, it's very hard to understand why you can do that over here. Oh no, you can't do that there.
Yeah, there was similar problems with MathML because a lot of the things in CSS didn't even exist when they were making the first MathML, and so there's duplication where there were things copied that were copied from like the days of font tags and stuff like that.
Yeah,
like where you put colors in as like a attribute of its own, and so there's we did for MathML the aligning of those things as well, where like we said, okay, well, these things, they're presentational hints now, and they take a color, and any CSS color, like whatever CSS color you can put in there is going to work. So yeah, I think the more we get to where there's as much as humanly possible one web, right? I think that's my ideal situation, where you have these three great technologies that work in as much as possible way, interchangeably, so that the logic that you use over here, you can use over there. I mean, when we started our work on MathML, there was no DOM at all. Like you couldn't say like dot. You could get a reference to a MathML element and say dot style, and it was like it would throw. It would say, what are you talking about? There's no dot style. But now that's all addressed. So anyway, I think it's really positive, and I'm excited about that. I hope that it makes you feel good that somebody still really cares about SVG, that there's still efforts, and I don't think that any of your work is in vain. Another thing that we could talk about, I guess, is there is in the W3C also this technical architecture group that is sort of like a, I mean, I think its role, you can clarify this, but like, I feel like its role has changed and evolved and adapted like over the years. But you were appointed to the tag in 2001 by Tim Berners-Lee, right? And you served there for 4 years, basically.
Yeah. So the tag was originally started because when documents came towards maturity and they wanted to make a recommendation, sometimes Tim would say, no, this whole thing, this is doing it wrong. It shouldn't be like that. Why? Well, in my head, it should be like this and this and this. And it was just it was too little feedback, too late. And it was very arbitrary and very much, the benign dictator model, which we didn't really work. So we wanted to actually capture it, put it down, argue about it, and have something that had more of a consensus to it. And honestly, one of the reasons that I was put forward onto the tag was because someone said to me, Chris, you're one of the few people that can just stand up and say to Tim, you're wrong. Whereas most people are like, oh, no, inventor of the web. So, and I did that for a bit, which didn't make me popular. But we spent so much time arguing about RDF and whether it did or did not break the web and all of this stuff, and how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Although I'm proud in some ways to be one of the authors of the Architecture of the World Wide Web Volume 1. On the other hand, I look at it now and go, it misses the point so much. And some of the things were very popular then, but not now, like the halt and catch fire method of error detection. Seriously, what is a user supposed to do in that point? It's like, your tab just crashed. Good luck with that. So some of it was wrong, but it was good work. And then, of course, it all got changed. The new guard came in and they started reviewing specs and reviewing them much earlier, which meant the feedback was actionable. And that was a big change.
Hmm.
And my wife Leah was also on the tag, but not at the same time. It was much, much later, until just last year, actually.
I was just going to say, I think you're the only husband wife team to ever serve on the tag, I believe.
I believe so,
Uh,
yes. Yeah, and I really want to thank Igalia again publicly now because of the childcare support, which meant that both of us could attend the meeting and, see her at the breaks and whatever, but we didn't have to worry about that. We could both attend, which was very, very valuable. Recently, there was a meeting hosted by Apple in Cupertino, and they did not provide childcare. But Zoe was very good. She sat on the side of the meeting with a tablet watching cartoons and was told very strongly, don't come and interrupt us unless it's really, really important. And she was great. But it meant she had a little badge because they apparently had to get permission for her to be a technical whatever something. So it actually says invited expert on her
that's
badge, and
excellent.
she's 5.5.
That's excellent. What else can we talk about? Do you want to talk about your experience on
I
HTML2?
actually have a funny story about that. So, yeah, I started working on HTML2 and I kind of parachuted in. Like, they were already very well established. There were a lot of people in Dan Connolly and these sort of people very keen on formal methods and document type definitions and all this sort of stuff. So it was all being done in HTML. But there was also this, of course, we don't expect anyone to have an HTML implementation. They don't have to follow all the rules, just, do the best you can. And it was all very woolly. And all of these people had like years or decades of experience doing this stuff. So I was kind of intimidated, but I also thought, no, this is stupid. So I actually started to write an email saying, why don't we have a grammar which defines exactly and precisely what we actually expect people to parse? And then we, never mind DTDs and whatever, totally new technology stack. Let's do that instead. Then we'll have a consistent parse tree, and I think that will help with the DOM as well, and blah, blah, blah. And then I realized there's like John Bozak and Michael Spurberg McQueen, and they've got decades between them of experience. And it's like, you know what? They're probably right. I just haven't got it yet. So I never sent the email. I didn't send it and have it shot down. I just, never mind, delete. And if I had, and if it had been accepted, which of course is far from given, we would have had consistent parsing between browsers 15 or so years before HTML5 rescued us by giving us consistent parsing in browsers. So this is one of my lifelong shame things, the sort of thing when I can't get to sleep at night, I'm like, oh, you idiot, if only you'd done, you know.
I wonder if we would still wind up with what working group in the end, because the very first thing that they took up was the parser, but I think that was mainly because they had to.
It was also because they wanted to describe the behavior, whereas the old HTML specs were literally just, here's the grammar. Oh, and by the way, the A element is about links and stuff, And it's like, no, that is not, is not a specification. You have to say exactly how fetch works and what happens when it's interrupted and how does it work with caches and all of this. That's why HTML took off. Not because you could have bold and things, but because it had elements like tables and forms that did stuff. And the same for SVG. It had things that actually did stuff. And so you just by writing a small amount of markup, you would get that behavior. And it was the encapsulating behavior, I think, that was the crucial thing.
So you had said that also you were at the first World Wide Web conference, right?
That's right, yeah.
What was that like? Because I wouldn't be involved in the web for another four, 4 or 5, maybe even years. So I definitely didn't get to attend those. So uh, tell me something about it.
Well, so as I said earlier, I was working on writing training materials about computer graphics. And most people were making what they called multimedia CD-ROMs, right? You'd get the CD duplicated, you'd stick it in your machine, you'd have this point and click type stuff, and it would do things, usually using some proprietary framework, and that was it. And we didn't do that. We wrote student notes and whatever in FrameMaker, I think. and slides. By slides, I meant things that you could print onto acetate and put on an overhead projector and project. That was what you used. That was what the state of it was. But I realized that because the web now existed, we could, instead of having to order these pre-printed or whatever, we could put the PostScript files up on the web, and we could put documents that we wrote on the web, and we could put programs that were demonstrations up on the web, and people could download them and run them. And we could update them over time when we found mistakes, rather than that was that edition, and maybe we'll do another one in 10 years. It's like, no, the one we put out last week, we realized it says this and it should say that. We changed it. So I wrote a paper about that, went to Barcelona to present that at a graphics conference, and that got me more involved. And so, yeah, that was where I got to go to the first web conference, because there was a part of it that was about use of the web in education. That wasn't my primary interest, actually. I was sneakily going there for all the other stuff. But, and that's where I met Dave Raggett, that's where I met Tim, that's where I met Dan Connolly for the first time.
You were talking about CD-ROMs, and it clicked a thing in my head. I'm curious, like, were you into like hypermedia before the web?
A little, not that much, honestly.
So there were things like HyperCard and
Yes.
like FileMaker Pro, things like that had, hypermedia style, creator um, bits where you could do a lot of that. But I wonder, have you ever heard of or met this guy Ian Ritchie? He made a bit of software. I think his software company was called Owl, and the software that he made was called Guide, and it was a hypermedia thing, like in the early '90s, basically when Tim was making the web, like before there was even a browser, and he is great. This like great short, like TED mini talk that's 5-10 minutes, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's really short. You can find on YouTube. Maybe we can link it up in the show notes, about how Tim actually approached him at a party in Vienna and was like, "Hey, maybe you could make the web browser, because like I'll just even contribute the all I want is a URL, like that's just, can we just add the URL? Because it already had networking, like it already did everything. And actually, this is really interesting. It was specified in a markup format,
Mm-hmm.
and it was called HML. And so there's this joke that, Tim added the T. So, yeah, I don't know. I think that's really interesting to think about, like, I don't know what, but before the web, there was almost the web. And even the way that Tim defined HTML was not by sitting down and saying, like, what tags do we need?
That one is very easy, because he looked at some CERN documentation on a thing called the IBM starter set, which
Right.
was for HTML. And that's where we get H1 to H6 and P and UL and LI and all that stuff.
Yeah, even GML before that, right? Like it dates
Yes.
all the way back to the
Yeah.
60s. So,
Right.
and they're that original set, and the first set that's in there, and also the set that's in Markdown, is like just exactly the set that you would think that would be, because they're the ones that would
Yeah.
be like on a typewriter. If you were, just typing on a typewriter, they're like, which things are the headings, and which things get some
Right.
kind of emphasis.
Speaking of other hypertext things, I did actually meet Ted Nelson a couple of times from Xanadu, and we had some interesting conversations, but I found him excited, kind of like Tim is, but also, I mean, he would casually say things like, and of course, to do this, we need a complete worldwide overhaul of the copyright system. And I could see that putting that as a prerequisite was not a path to success. But it was interesting ideas.
That's interesting. How did you meet? How did you meet him?
He was in Japan at the time, and I was there for a meeting in Japan. And I had dinner with him and Tim and Robert Caio. And
Has he been involved in anything for the web?
not
Because I know
really, not that I think.
he likes to kind of diss it a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he doesn't do the things that his system did, but his system also doesn't actually exist.
Yeah. So what else? The World Wide Web Conf.
Mhm.
You
Oh, yeah, actually, that reminds me. So on the way there, right, I'm on a plane to Switzerland, and some guy comes up and says to me, "Hey, you must be Chris Lilley." I'm like, "Yeah, I am actually. You going to the web conference?" "Yeah, I am actually." "How do you know?" He's like, "Well, your photos are on your webpage." "Oh,
ah
right."
nice. That I mean, I guess that's like probably there's a lot of people who can relate to that now, but
Mm.
you know, in the early '90s, not so much, right? I mean, that
Oh,
was
not at all. And people were mostly using dial-up, so you had tiny, tiny little images. I was looking at some of those like graphics now, and they're like, it looks like they're like 5 millimeters by 3 on the screen nowadays. It's tiny, tiny little things.
so. Also, speaking of this, I work at Igalia with Eric
Yeah.
Meyer,
Hmm.
and Eric has told this story. I think that you were the one to invite him to the CSS working group.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, rather than working in a vacuum, people who were putting up test pages and pushing for interoperability, yeah, I wanted those people involved. It's like, okay, well, I don't work for a member company. No, but you're doing really good work. So we want that. I mean, I did quite a bit of that in those days there. I also got Daniel Glasman to join and eventually become chair because he's like, you're doing it all wrong. This, and you shouldn't do that. And I said, well, come and fix it then. Come on, put your money where your mouth is. And he did. So that was great.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about color yet.
I was just going to say, you also are involved with color. You have forgotten more about color at this point than I will ever know. You and Leah, and I
Right.
believe Yuna now as well,
Mm-hmm.
have been working on the color spec. Um,
Yeah.
and I have seen some amazing uh, talks that you gave about this. And like, how long have you been studying color? Like,
Okay, so back in Manchester, I did write some training materials about color. This was a modular thing, and we were supposed to take like 3 months on each module. And I took, I think, probably a year and 3/4. And they were very annoyed at me, but I kept finding new stuff and not letting it go. I got really hyper focused on it. So that was a good thing, and it was well received. And that fed into PNG because I was the one that insisted we have to have tags for the gamma of the display and the chromaticity of the monitor, so you could actually get, that was the days where is this a Mac graphic or a PC graphics or an SGI graphic and that sort of thing. So I wanted that tied down. As to how long it took, in 2018, October, I think, I gave a talk to the International Color Consortium. It was an evening talk. It was after the meal, and it was an invited speaker sort of thing. I was just getting involved with them, and they said something light. So I called it Color at W3C: 20 Years of Pain, and I described all the attempts which had failed and why they failed and what had etc. And it ended up saying, "Oh, we have this thing called CSS Color 4. We just had the first working draft. I don't know if that's going to work or not, but I really hope so." Um, but it's interesting to think about what was different in that. Instead of writing a spec and saying, "Okay, guys, implement it." So one thing I noticed was that people found color very worrying, very off-putting. They thought, I mean, it is very complex, right? But at the basis of it, it's actually quite simple. So what I wrote was the simplest little bits of JavaScript. It's like, yeah, if you've got display P3 and you want to convert it to XYZ, then you do this. And if you've got XYZ and you want to convert it to sRGB, you do that. And it's basically mostly a matrix. It's like multiple, linearize it, multiply by this, and then add gamma back, and you're done. And by making it simple, I kind of tempted in the developers to use that, and it also meant that we could give examples. In the GitHub issues, we could say, well, this color would go to that, and everyone was using the same code. But it was horrible code because it was simple and procedural. So you had to you'd have like 6 or 7 nested function calls to do all the things. And if you didn't do it in the right order or the right, or you miss one out, then you get completely the wrong result. So with Leah and I, we did a different thing. It's the same math, but it's object oriented. So instead of like 2 lines of gobbledygook to convert one color thing to another, you would go RGB.2 and then whatever you wanted, like OK Lab, and it just converts it for you. And it knows how to do that. It can follow the chain of what it needs to convert one to the other. And that was great because people could use it. They could simply prototype things. The browsers were using that to check what their implementations were. And in many cases, they were copying the same matrices and whatever, so they got exactly the same results. So that really helped. It broke the chicken and egg thing. It meant that people could put that in and see what happened, and they could compare what their implementation did. And that, I think that really helped us move it forward. The other thing, of course, was Apple. Apple suddenly decided that P3 screens, wide gamut screens, were important. And then they put them on laptops and watches and phones and everything. And they all had the same wide gamut one. So they wanted people to use that. And that was really the impetus. Suddenly a major browser wanted to have this stuff, as opposed to, Chris, no one needs that stuff. That's just...
This is really funny because I remember in 2019, I was at Mozilla CSS working group face to face,
Yeah.
and I went. You and I talked. I think we went to dinner,
Mm-hmm.
and we were discussing this. And you were saying like, this is what we need, and we need to find somebody to do it and get it going. And
Yeah.
I wrote about it. I started talking to some people about it. And funny thing is that like a lot of people, I think I had a similar reaction. Like I grew up my whole life with CRT TV,
Mm-hmm.
and you watch the CRT from across the living room, and all those little dots pull together pretty well.
Right.
And it's convincing. And, if you had like the Sony Trinitron, nice,
Mm-hmm.
somehow you thought that's a nice sharp picture. And then like at some point it hit like if you saw it next to a modern display, you're like, what is that? Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, but you never felt like it was missing, and I feel like that's the experience that a lot of developers told me that they were having. And I've watched like slowly shift this Overton window, right? Like to where
Mm-hmm.
they understand, oh, wait, no, that's not the end of color. Like all the things I could express with sRGB is like not where color is limited, right? Like I thought
Yes.
I had all the colors, but I don't. And actually, those are beautiful. And there's all these other things that I can do with it. With these new specs, and then I think people start really getting excited about it. But it's funny how that shifts, right? Like how you don't know until you see it that you missed it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And another thing that helped, Sam Wenning, who was working at Apple at the time, took a big leap. He started implementing all this stuff, and some of it would change on like every couple of weeks, and he would just track. He was in at the issues. He would change the implementation. There are all these previews coming out of Safari, and each one would have in the change notes, I've done this, and I used the new matrices, do this. And the fact that he got that going and it was always tracking the spec was amazing, and also gave the other browsers something to aim at, because they didn't want this to be an Apple only thing, which it could have been, because the Windows machines and whatever, they took longer to get wide gamut screens.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that really helped getting developer interest. I mean, now that's a given, right? You have to get developer interest. There's no point writing the spec otherwise. But that really helped it. The one other thing that we really need is understanding. That's the thing. The specs are not written for the general public. People don't know what they can do, why they should do it. And I kind of cry sometimes when I see, some new bit of color syntax and all in a blog post or whatever, and all the examples use sRGB. And sometimes, often actually, because I'm an annoying person, I write off to the authors and say, why did you use sRGB? And they're like, there's two answers. One, I didn't think about it very much. And two, well, the colors I'm playing with are an sRGB, so I have to use that, right? I mean, no, it doesn't say that at all. Oh. So it's the understanding and it's the what can I actually do with this that is kind of missing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that for some of us, maybe you're an exception because you've been like so inundated with color for so long. But for me, like I don't want to say like I learned to think about color in sRGB. And so like if I turn to write a color, I like can kind of hunt and peck my way there in sRGB.
Hmm.
And I frequently do that because it's like the thing that I'm used to. So what are the I guess we'll see in another 5-10 years what the next generation of people who aren't limited by that and don't have like this burned in memory what they do. Hopefully it's not that.
Yeah, I mean, things like perceptual uniformity help and make it easier, but then they give you new problems. It's easy to go out of gamut. You take a color you like, you rotate the hue, and now it doesn't work anymore. And depending on what the browsers do with out of gamut colors, which is frankly terrible at the moment, then you lose a lot of the benefit. But yeah, I think having something where you can say, no, this color visibly looks between these two. I want a gradient between this and that, and the middle color looks like what you'd expect the middle color to look like. That wasn't a given before.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. That's for sure. Those are great examples actually. The uh like gradients are amazingly better. So I think that's about all the time that we have.
Can I tell you a quick funny story first?
Absolutely, yeah.
So there is a great video on YouTube by Alex Sexton, I think, and it's about the X11 colors and what stupid names they have and blah. And it goes through the early history of color. And my involvement was quite early on, so I was a bit more abrasive then than I am now, my nice, refined, and polite self. So he said, now we have Chris Lilley. Basically an asshole. Also frequently correct. I don't know, I kind of want that on my gravestone. It's like...
Excellent. So thank you.
You're
And
welcome. Thanks,
I've
Brian.
never found you to be an asshole. But great. This is really fun. Thanks, Chris.
It was, thank you.